Hello, everybody. Before anything, I'm going to just put it out there and see if you can hear and see me. Tim, Jody, Luke, I think some of these guys who have been at these webinars before, let's just get this easy technical thing out of the way, jump into the Q&A box and say, yep, can see and hear, and we can move on. Oh, there's hands up. Thanks, Tim. That's enough for me. I'm going to assume you can see the right screen as well. Okay, thank you very much. For anything, I just want to acknowledge the First Nation people throughout the nation. I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the people of the Kulin Nation, the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, but I know we're coming from all different places. I wish to acknowledge the First Nation people as the traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and elders from other communities, and acknowledge the land that we meet on is a place of age-old ceremony, celebration, initiation and renewal, and was never ceded. It's great to have everybody here today. We're going to be talking about Snapshot. We've got some special guests, Rebecca Duffy from the DES, Annie Nolan from Noosa, people who will be familiar to a lot of you, I'm sure. Heidi Edmonds from BZE and Patricia Camino are also on the line with Imogen Judd for BZE in case there are some tricky questions. I'm going to do the most briefest of housekeeping. I know that we're all used to using Zoom and Teams and all these things at the moment, but GoToWebinar might be a little bit new to people. So the first thing is that only presenters can be heard or seen during the presentation. You're encouraged to ask any questions that you have in the GoToWebinar question box. There's a little thing that's up there that says questions, jump in there and ask away. We'll try and answer them as we go along, or we may wait till the end. And because they're all captured there, rest assured that if we don't get to them all today, we'll follow up after the webinar. Try and be as specific as you can, please, when typing in your questions. I'm going to first hand over briefly to Beck Duffy from the Department of Environment and Science. Beck, are you there?
Thanks, Lex, and hello everyone. I too would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet, and in my case that's the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also just want to recognise the role that First Nations and traditional knowledge and healed relationships between First Nations and other groups will play in our efforts to address climate change. And look, I won't take up much time because I think, you know, we're all here to hear about Snapshot tool and to hear from Ironbark on that. But I just wanted to thank you all for attending and thank Ironbark Sustainability and Beyond Zero Emissions, but also our collaborators at the Local Government Association of Queensland in bringing this together. And I hope that it will be a useful discussion. I hope it'll be useful for furthering our journey and our transition to a zero net emissions future, and in a way that best supports our communities and our businesses. And really, that's all I wanted to say. So I'm happy for us to crack on. So thank you, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Beck. And yeah, it's been great getting to know you guys and working with you over this year and being part of the broader Snapshot process. Okay, here is what we're going to go through today. A bit of an introduction, background to community emissions profiles, how you develop them and how we develop them, how this has led to Snapshot. We'll go through a couple of case studies, jump into some of the data because we've specifically had questions and queries around data, look at the future of Snapshot and all the possibilities that we have in this tool that is sort of the tool of a few organisations, and hopefully a tool that sort of gets collective ownership from a lot more. We're going to have a presentation from Annie Nolan, who's going to talk about zero emissions Noosa, and then at the moment, I believe we've got a good 15 minutes for Q&A, so hopefully we'll be able to get all your questions as well. Jump into the question box if you have any. This is us. Ironbark Sustainability, so as most of you know, if not, all we do is work with councils around Australia on climate and sustainability projects. We've got about 35 odd staff, probably only about 22 full-time equivalents, and we just work in various offices with councils, and that's kind of all we do. This isn't an Ironbark presentation though. Snapshot is a collaboration between Beyond Zero Emissions and Ironbark. BZE, if you're not familiar with them, internationally recognised climate change think tank. They produce independent and innovative research solutions demonstrating that zero emissions Australia is absolutely achievable and affordable. And their reports provide pathways to 10-year plans that I would highly recommend you check out. And if you haven't already checked out or aren't familiar with the Million Jobs Plan, go to the BZE website or just type in Million Jobs Plan and you'll find it there. This is you. So this is the registration, the councils that have registered for this webinar. We had about 38 in the end, and we've got a lot of multiple representation from certain councils. So welcome and thank you. We also asked a few other questions in advance that we used to try and, I guess, tailor the discussion and the workshop the best way we can, and also to let you know who's there and who's here. This was the question, just in case you're interested. Most people that are on the call have been at councils for a decent amount of time. We also asked whether you have or had a community emissions profile before Snapshot, and most people, nope. A couple of people said yep, and it was up to date. Mind you, I think all of those people came from Brisbane, maybe one or two others. And we also asked you if you had any questions or comments, and so some of these we're going to get to at the end, a bit more about the methodology, wanting to get involved. Someone said thank you, interested to hear more. Thank you too. Finally, this is the one slide that you need to quickly take notes on and get everything down. No, you don't. You'll get these slides at the end, so don't worry about this. I'm just keeping it there so you can see the answer to this question, which was why would knowing your community emission be valuable? And so this is the sort of response that we had from everybody that registered. And I've kind of, in the last few days, went and tried to group them up a little bit together. And the majority, or most people, talked about, using it to target emissions reduction. How do we develop programs and projects in the right places, targeting the right areas? There are a few that talked about benchmarking, reporting, tracking emissions, beginning the low carbon journey was there a lot, talking about baseline data. There was a little bit of that engaging the community. And one point I'll note is this will be the first of a couple of webinars. We'll hold a few more next year, and we might look at, depending on how we go today, incorporating more sort of community council links. A few people just put in the works, which was great, and a few other bits and pieces like useful for applying for funding and other bits and pieces. So this is kind of the summary of it. And again, you'll get all this information back to you to have a look and, see if it's kind of sort of consistent with what you understand, what emission profiles are for, how they can be assisting, and possibly things that you might not have thought of that could be worth as well. Okay. This is a slide that many people might have seen. They've been to Ironbark workshops, because 15 years ago, 240 odd councils around Australia actually did have emissions profiles for their whole community. And those ticked the box and said they've been at council for more than 7 years, might actually recall having been a part of the Cities for Climate Protection program. I bring this up a lot because it's actually quite interesting to talk about what we've learned from those days when we had these profiles for communities and the things that potentially we did wrong at the time, things that we can learn from. And having been involved within that program at the time, it is interesting to look back. The reason that 240 councils sort of no longer had profiles though was, interestingly, when this guy came in with the CPRS, or Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, if anybody can remember that carbon price that never was, all of the ancillary projects and programs funding cut. And so this particular program, local government program, CCP, had no funding. So instead of 240 councils that had emissions profiles representing 84% of population, over the last couple of years, that kind of dwindled. So this is some work that BZE and Ironbark did with Oceania a few years ago, and we're about to undertake this survey again. Really valuable info. We kind of got to the stage where over the last 4 or 5 years, most councils don't actually have an emissions profile. It's the opposite of what you see with corporate emissions, and so your organisational internal emissions, where it's a little bit easier to track and understand. This has changed a little bit recently, and especially in the lead up to the Paris climate talks in 2016, and local government programs like the Compact of Mayors, which is now called the Global Covenant of Mayors. These programs required councils to say, here is an emissions inventory or profile for our municipality. And so being a part of this movement, we really needed to know where our emissions were coming from. And so that was the impetus for quite a few councils to start developing emissions profiles. And so in the space of a couple of years, we sort of had a situation where 5, 10, then 20, then 30 councils were doing this work. The C40 Cities Group and the City of Melbourne about 3 years ago had a project that involved developing profiles for 32 councils in Greater Melbourne. DPI in New South Wales, formerly called the OEH, did the same thing. So suddenly you had all these different groups sort of looking into it again. Beyond Zero Emissions were working a lot with community groups as well, and councils doing exactly the same thing. And part of this process, it wasn't just sort of direct consultation from a consultant to a council, just give them the data and move on, but there was a fair bit of capacity building and improved literacy. So there's info that's out there at the moment. So C40, for example, in Ickley, this project involved workshops, putting information out there that meant anybody could go and learn more about what we're doing and how this works. So, how do you develop an emission profile? Another question that we asked at the start, do you know what the GPC is, or the Global Protocol for Community Greenhouse Emissions? And again, we use this to try and frame the conversation a little bit. A fair few people, probably half yep and half not really sure or absolutely no idea, and that is okay. We'll go quickly through what it is and then talk about how we use it and why it's really important and underpins kind of everything that we're doing here. So this is what it is, the horrifically named Global Protocol. It's basically this 250-page document that tells you how you account for emissions within your municipality. It's really important because it means that if we're all using and singing from this same song sheet and understanding how we actually do measure our emissions compared to neighbouring councils' emissions, we're not double counting, we're not missing out on any emissions areas. This protocol, so it's like an accounting protocol, so everyone uses the same thing, was developed by a bunch of leading national and international organisations as well, and so the beauty of it means that everybody is on the same page. The first thing that it sort of does is says, right, we need to look at all of our stationary energy, electricity, gas, our transport emissions and waste. And that's considered a basic profile or a basic inventory. For Australia, those three sectors for local governments generally will look after 92, 93% of all emissions. And then you've got basic plus, which looks at ag, forestry, land use, industrial processes. So for most councils, this is not going to be a big issue. For some, it's a massive issue, as you can imagine, regional and rural councils that might have a lot of ag emissions. You look under the bonnet of this GPC protocol and it tells you how you actually measure things. What do you do about transport? What do you do about cars that are coming in one municipality and out the rest? How do you actually measure which emissions do you allocate to you, which emissions do you allocate to someone else? And there's a lot of stuff under the bonnet that tells you all the different ways that you could go about it. It does get nice and detailed and nice and confusing, which is why, to be honest, you can, if you love this sort of stuff, go in and check it out. You can go and read this document that's freely available. You can go and do a course and learn everything you want about it, but it is pretty damn boring for most people and potentially not the best use of time. Luckily, one of the people that was involved in developing this thing, a guy called Matt Sullivan, is pretty much one of the key brains behind Snapshot and works with us in developing emissions profiles. So I've flicked through that quite quickly because there is a bit of info there, and you're always welcome, of course, to go back and check any of those slides and resources, and there are a lot of resources out there. The main thing is to say that everything that underpins Snapshot and the development of these profiles is based on this standard. It's like if you're doing a corporate inventory, it's based on NGES and NCOS. The one thing I will mention is there's some key critical principles around the collection of data. Data needs to be relevant, complete, consistent, transparent, and accurate, and it's in that order. And so according to the rulebook, GPC, you've got to get data that is relevant and complete. So it's, captures the whole municipality, consistent, you can get it year on year, and transparent before you look at accurate data. It's not to say accurate data is not important, but data is basically thrown out unless it meets those first 4 principles. This is why we always refer to community profiles as profiles, because inventory is a little bit misleading. It's not as accurate as perhaps we would like it to be or as it is right now. So profiles, even calling them a baseline can be a little bit challenging because the data is hard to source at times and we don't have control over that as a local government industry, and it's likely to change. And that's not meant to sound, too negative, or it's not necessarily a bad thing, because bit by bit the data gets better, and through Snapshot, once we lift 1 or 2 councils, we lift all 537 around Australia, because it goes into this sort of common good or common asset. So over the last 4 or 5 years, we've all been looking at these things and talking together, and BZE and Ironbark basically said we're doing the same things, the same people, and as councils and community groups are still spending time, with their heads down in something like the GPP protocol, instead of actually doing stuff and, tackling climate change and implementing climate action, then we're not doing our jobs. And so we put all of our resources together. Originally got some funding from those organisations on the left-hand side of the screen, and developed Snapshot. We've had technical review, external endorsement from other organisations as well. The whole intention is really to make it a broad sort of partnership approach. So in the various states, FC in Victoria, New South Wales State Government, DEF, obviously in Queensland, have funded it. In Northern Territory, it was Local Government Association. Interesting one in South Australia where the state government, Local Government Association, weren't in a position to fund. But the 15, 16 odd councils said, all right, well, let's just crowdfund it. And basically all chipped in 2 or 3 grand to get that whole state on board. And this is the result. Snapshot Climate, I would assume most people have at least, been interested in this presentation and had a bit of a look or checked it out, that you can jump on board and have a look at any snapshot, any emissions profile. The intention is to have accessible data for everyone within Australia, not just councils, but community groups as well. And as we improve the back end for a couple of councils, or we get better data somewhere, we can improve it for everyone. The website's got a bunch of FAQs. It's actually quite a detailed resource now that I would encourage you to check out if you like. The methodology is all there and transparent, and you can also download a 2-page PDF report if you're interested. One of the things that came up in the questions or the comments was around sort of, I guess, benchmarking and comparing, which is a really interesting one, and I just thought I'd put this slide up here briefly, because you can absolutely go and have a look at your municipality compared to others. We do on the FAQ page have a little bit of information about how you can and can't, and maybe should and shouldn't use snapshots as a comparison, because it can often be a little bit misleading. So here's Gold Coast and Launceston in Tassie, and different people will look at this in different ways. So potentially some people will just look at the fact that Gold Coast is a lot larger in total emissions, which makes sense, even though the 2 donuts are still the same size when you look at the 2 of them. The other thing is you see large, significant proportion of electricity emissions from Gold Coast, less for Lonnie, and geez, a lot of transport emissions from Launceston. So that might mean that they're not great when it comes to transport. It's probably more likely, of course, the Tasmanian grid is all pretty much renewables, so they're going to therefore have a large component of transport emissions. So often it's more, it's better to look at cohorts. You can actually download cohort reports, which automatically looks at reports that are your similar type of municipality from the website. There is a charge for that. To be honest, I wouldn't jump on and pay for that just yet, because we're looking at how we can improve it. But if you are interested in that, that's the only paid function of Snapshot, which is there to, I guess, do the basic admin and get things moving along. But what it does is it says, right, based on all of the data, here are your 10, 15 cohort councils that are actually similar type, size, GDP, makeup, whatever it might be. And that's potentially a better way to understand comparisons. So Snapshot was first released about 16, 17 months ago in Victoria and New South Wales. And since then, the main way that councils have been using it has actually been what you guys put in the answer to the question, which is sort of targeting action areas. So making sure that we as a sector are putting time and effort into the right places. Here's an example from Central Coast in New South Wales. where if you look at their snapshot, one of the things that they've got a fair bit of is transport emissions. And so some of the work that they've subsequently done has been, I guess, looking further into that subsector and what they can do. And this is from actual data for the Central Coast, where they looked at an intervention like EV charging use and electric vehicle, infrastructure and installation. And so they dig deeper, having looked at where their emissions generally are, and then looked at the sort of things that they can do to reduce emissions in that area. For example, installing electric vehicle charging. Interesting, this slide I put up because what this shows is where EVs and uptake of EVs is sort of heading anyway without any intervention from Central Coast. So if Central Coast do nothing, by about the year 2030, they're going to have, a big change anyway, and possibly half of all new vehicles will be electric, regardless of what they do. And so the extra information there, and they look at what they could do and what would make that above business as usual. Another example is DECA, which is the group of councils in Melbourne Southeast, and they've been using the profile to, again, understand the key emission sources, but investigating how they can start engaging with community stakeholders. And one of the differences here is, I guess, they're looking at, community much broader than the traditional sort of residential community sense of the words, especially commercial and industrial, where they can often find most of the emissions areas to reduce. And so what Snapshot has meant for these guys is, instead of focusing on just collecting data and generating the information to make the decisions, they've already got access to that information, and they can start moving on to useful decision making and allocating resources to real action, I guess. This is one of the councils in that region, Greater Dandenong, and as you can see, Greater Dandenong has a massive component of electricity and especially industrial. And one of the sort of things that's been noted by a lot of the councils is often the small amount of residential electricity emissions, potentially a misalignment of funds that are going into that area, when if they've got targets to reduce emissions to zero by 2030, 2035, whatever it might be, they need to move on from residential electricity emissions quick smart and on to the rest of them. And so they'll then do analysis, again, looking at residential emissions, solar PV on owner-occupied buildings. This is the same sort of chart as one before. And if I click the button to show you what they can do, that green line you can barely see there, because not only is it only 7% of their emissions, there's also not necessarily a great lot of deal they can do above what's already happening due to state government, communities doing their own stuff, changing technology. That's not to say that they don't then look at supporting these areas. Solar PV on rentals, for example, they can see that there's a fair bit that can be done on top of what is already out there. This isn't incorporated within Snapshot. We would love it to be incorporated into Snapshot into the future, but it's an indication of how councils are using that data to just get straight into those sectors where they need to target action. So for the Greater Dandenong, or for those councils in the southeast of Melbourne or in parts of up and down the coast of New South Wales, Gladstone, Cobra in Western Australia, for example, industrial emissions. Therefore, it's often a matter of looking at the key sources, such as a lot of the work done by BZE, that will assist in making sure that we can look at ways to target those areas where we really need to target. Snapshot's been used by a lot of councils just from a comms point of view because it looks good, crisp and clear. So here's an example from Newcastle, working with other consultants, I think, on how they can look at reducing their emissions, and also the scale of the challenge. The sort of piecemeal responses to climate change is not necessarily sufficient. And if you're developing a climate action plan or an emergency plan or whatever it might be, Snapshot kind of makes it pretty clear that those big numbers do need to get down low pretty quick smart. And so it's used to communicate the scale of the challenge and then make sure that the action is commensurate to that scale. All of the data has been checked a lot of times. And so 4 or 5 years ago, in the lead up to Paris, It was all done by the GPC protocol. 3 or 4 of the staff that were involved in developing the data at the start undertook these examinations to make sure that they were registered as city climate planners. And there was a lot of toing and froing with stakeholders in Bonn and Brussels, where the Global Covenant Mayors and ICLEI live, to sign off on the data essentially. Having been involved in that process 3 to 4 years ago, it was quite time consuming and the sort of thing that we don't want to be replicating 537 times around Australia. When the C40 project that they put on with Greater Melbourne came about, again, all the data needed to be checked and considered GPC compliant with that tick from C40. Since then, as Snapshot has matured, other organisations have checked out the data to make sure that it's okay. So the likes of Renew, who are another brilliant energy and renewables organisation or consultancy, went through the data. Organisations like Google have gone through, say, transport specifically to make sure that they're comfortable with it. And it's now at the extent where if you were going to look at joining a program like the Global Covenant of Mayors, which is the international program and link into what's happening with the next couple of COPs or conference parties, the data's already been pre-approved as compliant. And you can see it for yourself. So if you go to Snapshot Climate, the website, the methodology's there, it gets updated all the time. If you are a data nerd, then jump in and have a look around, and always happy to chat about ways that we can improve it, bearing in mind that we need to make sure that we're compliant with the protocol. I did mention earlier on about the fact that the data, we have these 5 principles: relevant, complete, consistent, transparent, and then accuracy kind of at the end. All through this process, we're going and talking to other data providers.
Sorry to interrupt, Lex. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello?
Yeah, sorry, sometimes you're a little bit unclear. You're a little bit unclear sometimes. I wonder if you just, maybe might need to, hold the microphone. Sorry, thank you.
No, thank you. Sorry about that. Please jump in, and yourself and anyone as well. If there's similar issues, please jump into the Q&A box. I will talk clearly. It could be just my voice getting closer, but thank you to interrupt me if that is the case. That's not good. So over the course of the journey, we've been looking at better data sources. And again, the idea is not just to get data sources for Gold Coast or Mackay or Sydney or Penrith, but the whole state and then the whole country, because so much of the data that you get and you input into these things can be used for everyone, as long as it covers off on these things. One of the key questions we get a lot is around the energy data and, why can't we get better data from Energex, Ergon, and why can't we include it in there? Because at the moment, the data on Snapshot for the main is not from those guys, and it's state-based data that is scaled down to the municipal level based on a lot of different factors. So for residential energy, it's mainly going to be population. Commercial and industrial, it's a lot more complex than that. The issue is that the data that you get from Energex and Ergon, and I think Annie might be touching on this a little bit too, is not complete. And so they don't provide you with all of the info, and it's not transparent. You don't know why it may or may not be changing. It would be great if they could. And so I'm actually going to open up a really quick poll here in the last few minutes before I pass over to Annie. And I'm going to ask everyone here this question. If tomorrow, in the next few days, Energex, Ergon come up to us and say, we can give you all the data, we're going to make it all public, postcode level. It's going to have everything you need, residential, industrial, the works, and you will be able to use it within Snapshot. You can check it out, and I can guarantee you it's going to be complete and compliant. Should we incorporate this Snapshot? I'm going to launch this poll. 31 attendees online at the moment. What do we do? At the moment, we've got state-based data that ends up being scaled down to the municipal level. If we can source the more accurate data, tell me now, should we put it into Snapshot? You need to jump in, please. 64% of people have voted. 68. I'll give you another 10, 15 seconds. Thank you for doing it. Yep, can we get this up 80%? Come on, 1 or 2 more, please. Are you going to include this or not? Come on. Yes, no, maybe, not sure. Okay. Yes, say 90%. Not sure, say 10%. 84% of people voted. Great. That's generally what happens when we launch similar sort of polls, and certainly I completely concur that of course we want to include the more valuable, more accurate information, as long as it does mean that it is complete and transparent. The thing that we need to just remember though is that it's going to mean there'll be change, and often it's just going to be gradual change. But if we get that more accurate or more granular information, it means the profiles are going to be changing, which is why sometimes it's hard to use the snapshot or any, I would argue, any community profile anywhere in Australia as kind of a baseline, because a lot of the changes that we're going to get might still be because of better data. But again, it's not to be defeatist, because it will get better, and we're already seeing that over time. All right, over the next couple of years, we are looking at better data, more accurate data, and the example that I had up there before of Google is a really good one, and there are a few questions about this that came in advance that I will leave to the end but answer. But yeah, we're getting data from Google now to inform a lot of the transport emissions in the profile, and this carries on under the bonnet and behind the scenes from the BZE and Ironbark team every single day to make sure that we can improve on it, and we improve it for everyone. We would love to incorporate something like action planning automatically, so communities and councils can actually not just click on something that says, you know, here is our industrial emissions, but what else do we do about it now based on this information? What should we actually be doing to reduce emissions? We're really interested and into collaboration, and so that might mean working with something like, say, BZE's Million Jobs Plan, and the stakeholders involved in that, to see how we can incorporate more information or more valuable information to councils. The ability to just press a button and report for those councils that are involved in the, you know, the global programs. It's a real pain in the backside reporting at times. It'll be much easier now that we've had pre-approval that data is compliant, to be able to just click a button and report automatically. This data should be available and transparent. And finally, targets. So we can say not only here is your profile and here are your emissions, but here's the trajectory, here's where we're planning to get to, whether it's a council endorsed target, net zero by 2030, 40, 50, whether it's a science drive target or in line with states, the ability to actually also see how we're going. And then as we get better data, how we're actually tracking as well. All right. Annie, I am about to pass on to you. Before I do, or as I do, I'm also going to remind everybody to please jump in and ask any questions through the GoToWebinar question box. I'm going to make Annie the presenter.
Okay, thanks, Lex. Can everybody see that?
Perfect.
Net zero emissions by 2026?
Yep, all good.
Okay, cool. All right. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to have a bit of a chat about what Noosa is doing. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land where I am, that's the Gubbi Gubbi or Cubbi Cubbi people, and pay my respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. So what I'd like to do is just take you through a little bit, as quick as I can, through the Noosa story, I suppose, and where we came from. So what you're seeing there, sorry, to take a step back, is that we've also been involved in Cities for Climate Change and all those initiatives through ICLAI back in the dim, dark past. So I'm pretty much talking about from 2016, which is when Noosa was from 2014, when Noosa was de-amalgamated from the Regional Sunshine Coast Council. So as you can see up on the screen, we developed our organisational strategy for net zero emissions back in 2016. Okay, so as I said, back in 2016, we developed an emissions reduction policy. And that policy was all around getting to net zero emissions for council as an organisation by 2026. So council really felt that we needed to get our own house in order before we started telling the community that you need to be net zero emissions as well. So that plan has very much, and that strategy has very much directed the work that's been done internally in council around energy efficiency, renewable energy, and also looking at our waste to landfill, which is our most significant organisational contributor. We also have a very, very active and proactive, passionate community group called Zen Inc. And it gets a little bit confusing because council started to call its program Zero Emissions Noosa, and now we have our very active Zen Inc. community group who also goes by the name of Zen. So the way I try to differentiate it is when I'm just talking about Zen, that's the council initiative. When I'm talking about Zen Inc., it's the community group. So Zen Inc. basically said, well, that's great, council. Thanks for great that you're going to get to net zero emissions by 2026. But we really see that the whole of Noosa Shire also should be net zero emissions by 2026. And so they developed a memorandum of understanding with business groups and community associations and environment groups, etc., all signed on to that net zero emissions by 2026 for the Noosa Shire MOU. Just to point out that both of these targets were not determined by the use of science-based targets. These were done back in 2016, and 2026 seemed a long way away. So now as a result of that, in 2009, we developed the Noosa Council Environment Strategy. Oops, there's a typo in there. And we actually included the net zero emissions target for 2026 for the whole of Noosa Shire and also Noosa Council as an organisation following extensive community consultation. So those targets have actually now been included in our environment strategy. What Zen Inc. did was that they commissioned, with some funding from the Noosa Biosphere Reserve Foundation, to actually develop a Noosa roadmap to achieve 100% renewable energy by 2026. And that report was done by ITP Renewables. And I've put a link there, so if anybody's interested, you can have a look at that. But basically what that report did was to have a look at the current energy usage throughout Noosa Shire, and then work out some recommendations for what the whole of the community and council can do to reduce those emissions. So they use the Energex data for residential and commercial to estimate that electricity consumption. So we then also said, well, if we're going to look at, this was back in 2018, we really need to have a better understanding of what our Noosa Shire emissions profile is. So we engaged Ironbark to prepare a GPC compliant basic profile for us. And the reason why we went with basic was because that was going to cover, as Lex said, the most emissions for a local council, being stationary energy, transport and waste. So what I've got up there is that you can see an excerpt from that report, basically saying that our overall emissions were around about the 500,000 tonnes mark for the Noosa Shire. And as a result of that, we've been using that for our communications, etc. We then also engaged Ironbark to develop a whole series of action options analysis for us. And that was based on the recommendations from the ITP Renewable Roadmap. So it was basically things like looking at a whole series of things that have been done in other councils, such as solar bulk buys, embedded networks, encouraging environmental upgrade agreements, which we don't have yet in Queensland, solar saver programs. And what they did was that they used their methodology to develop a MAC curve, which we had very much used for our internal operations to be able to show the priorities and where we were going to get the best bang for our dollar spend in terms of emissions reduction. So we now are using that to develop programs, and we've recently just entered into a partnership with the Australian Energy Foundation to provide education and a solar information line and preferred providers for the Noosa community, which was based on one of the recommendations from the ITP report. The way that we're using the profile is, as I said, with community consultation with community. We've included in the environment strategy of 2019, and we're looking at the development and budgeting of our council-led community initiatives, recognising that we can't do everything, and council has got a specific role to play in reducing overall community emissions and can't do everything. So, as I said, we've partnered with the AEF. Currently, we are in the phase of developing the climate change response plan, which will look at both our council's own emissions again and where we're up to with that, but also more broadly to look at the community emissions reduction plan. And we'll also be including adaptation strategies in there as well. So we're currently developing that, and certainly the profile that was developed back in 2018 has been front and centre of that consultation with community, particularly Zen Inc, and also the development of this plan. So we're looking at, we consistently use the 500,000 tonnes as what we need to reduce to get net zero emissions. Then Snapshot came along and we had some differences from the original GPC compliant basic report that IMBARC did for us and the Snapshot profile that is available on the website. And so we've had a lot of discussions between IMBARC and ourselves about particularly the data for stationary energy, and members of Zen Inc were also involved in that discussion to understand the differences between the Energex data that is publicly available and what is actually not available publicly, but we had actually used in the ITP report, and subsequently the bespoke profile, basic profile that IMBARC did for us to get to that 500,000 odd tonnes. So you can see there that there's quite a big difference between what we're currently using of 500,000 tonnes to 675,000 tonnes in the snapshot report. So some of the challenges that we're seeing with the data sources is, as we said, and Lex continues to allude to, is that Energex doesn't include all the data for industry. However, the model data may also miss some regional specifics. And we had a lot of discussion about this, particularly around the industrial processes category, because initially in the model data, that was coming up a lot higher than what we know is actually happening in Noosa. Anybody who's been to Noosa knows that there's not a lot of heavy, big industry around. So that was some of the problems that we're still trying to get through. And the other thing that we have to understand is that it is not a monitoring tool. And right from 2018, IMBARC actually stated on that it should be stressed that while this profile contains a snapshot allocated to the activity within Noosa Shire municipality, it's currently not suitable as a monitoring tool for measuring the success of targets or actions. So one of the things that, of course, our community and our councillors are asking us is, are we nearing net zero emissions, and when will we know when we get there, particularly as the data does change, and that's a real challenge for us. As stated up there, the significant data revisions, and then we need to be consistent with the Queensland state target of net zero emissions by 2050, and if we ever, get a federal target of net zero emissions. So that's just a brief overview of how we're currently using our community profile. we work very, very well and very closely with Zen Inc. To develop these community actions that will be coming through in our climate change response plan. Oops, and I think I've gone over time.
You can have
Thanks.
those 2 extra minutes. Is totally fine. Thank you, Annie. That is awesome. I'm going to try and get back to my screen. Not what you want to see. Possibly what you want to see, and I'm assuming people can hear me now. Thank you so much, Annie. Everybody else, please keep jumping in and putting questions down. Annie, I've got an initial question for you. The changes from the 499,000 tonnes, the initial one to the 675,000 tonnes, and as you mentioned, we'll touch on this in a second, for a while there it was about 800,000 tonnes. Have those changes impacted on any decisions that you made along the way?
No decisions, no, because regardless of what the specific number says, it's the percentage of emissions in stationary energy and transport that we know the two big things that we need to hit. So regardless of whether it's 500,000, 675,000 tonnes or even a larger number than that, we know that those are the two heavy hitters within Noosa Shire, and unless we get those reduced, we're just playing with the numbers, really.
Yeah, great. And my understanding, and this is one of the reasons why we wanted to actually, when we discussed it, to have Annie talk, because it's also, we think it's quite important to talk about the warts and all the times and some of the challenges that we have, and this is a really good example. Because we don't have that data from Energex, we will get there. We've got a lot of processes in play, and if you've got better relationships with them as well, let us know. But we're trying to work with distribution businesses everywhere. Until we have that complete information, though, we use scaling factors. And what happens in industry is that you can scale by certain ways of doing it, but we've had some changes because ABS released new data that filled some gaps. And that meant we could use some other data from Australian Energy Statistics to reconcile sources, and that meant that we're able to trace heavy industry better. So people working in mines, heavy manufacturing technicians, and subsets of data as well. I think what happened with you guys was that you have a quarry, is that correct? Which is actually a very low emissions industry.
Yes, there's a couple of small quarries in Noosa Council, Noosa Shire. Yeah.
So one of the things that ends up happening is that what we need to do as we keep improving is to make sure that it's not then captured that Noosa looks like they've got a lot of, or a certain number of people working in the industry, but actually then going down to look at exactly what that industry is. Or what can also happen is someone might be working for Rio Tinto, but in an office in a capital city. And so that skews it. And so this is these are the improvements that we, I guess, make along the way. And when that happens, so we've moved it down from to the 675,000 tonnes. And so from what I saw there, the main difference between the 675,000 tonnes and the 500,000 tonnes is just the industrial emissions. Is that correct?
Yeah, and there was a bit in transport as well, but I think that is again due to the changes and improvements in data collection. Because I mean, if you think about it, we did this report going back into 2018, which doesn't seem very long ago, but I think in terms of data sources, it probably was. So again, that's why I think there's that difference in the transport emissions.
Great. There's a question from Tim in Mackay. I think this is for you. How did you finalise the signatories on your net zero MOU?
So it wasn't a council-led initiative. It was the Zero Emissions Noosa Inc., the community group, that actually arranged that MOU. And if you knew the president of Zen Inc., a very tenacious, incredible woman, she's basically held a lot of communication sessions and explained the reasons why that they had to go down that point of view, and got the signatories on those on that MOU. I think it's also, Noosa is also very well known and renowned for its environmental credentials and its green, clean environment. It's also a Noosa, sorry, it's a biosphere, World Heritage Biosphere, World Biosphere, as well. So lots of reasons why it was I think a bit easier in Noosa to do it.
Awesome. Keep those questions coming. What I'm going to do is scroll back to this slide. These were the questions that were asked in advance or noted in advance, and I think there's only 2 here. We did go through the methodology. I hope that was okay, and the rest was just nice comments. Some councils have a more comprehensive breakdown of their transport emissions than Toowoomba. What do we need to get this same level of data? So this is where Google comes in. So even though we generally, we talk about the struggles of getting data from electricity distribution businesses, and we can get good residential and commercial data, but industry's a problem. And there's legitimate reasons why they might not say something, because they might not, want to identify one particular big user. If you've got one big energy user in a particular postcode, then it'll show up and everyone will know that it's, if it was in New South Wales, it's BlueScope in Wollongong, or some of the large Gladstone industries. So while that's hard, transport's even harder, because we don't know the cars going in and out everywhere. So basically, the key reason we've always called emissions profiles is because we don't know. We don't have access to details of cars and trucks and buses or whatever it is going in and out of your municipality and how far they're going. Google do, because Google have got phones in most cars. So when you check your Google Maps, you're seeing, cars moving, where they are, coming in and out. And they've been using it for a product called Environmental Insights Explorer. And we've been working with them 2 years now to try and get that data and incorporate it into Snapshot. 100 councils around Australia now have that data, that Google data for transport, in their Snapshot profile, and another 86 are on the way. The reason the 100 are there is it's totally to do with the certain criteria and thresholds. So population is the big one, which means that it's generally going to be the large council areas that do get that data. And then there's also issues around density. So they're not confident in the numbers unless they've got enough, high enough density. I don't know whether Toowoomba are in that next tranche of 86. I can find out and let you know. But regardless, again, what we do in the background is we can use that info and that data, and there's an ongoing relationship with Google to improve it, not just for those that have it or have access to it, but for everyone. The other point, can I use Snapshot in moving towards the net zero carbon position? Snapshot can't do that on its own, but I'd argue that it definitely can help get there. I think that's when you need to sort of look at the action planning side of things. And so I'm not sure where that question came from, but that gives you an understanding about where your emissions are in your municipality. And the next step is then finding out what you're going to do about it. I will quickly shout out, there's a webinar that we're having next Tuesday. It's an Ironbark webinar, Beyond Zero Emissions, is going to be there, as well as someone from Breakthrough Climate Institute and ICLEI Oceania, where we're going to talk about targets and science drive targets. And so welcome to come along to that if you'd like, because that might inform that a little bit. I think it absolutely can start it, but then, the next step is then what you're going to do about those pieces of the pie. And that's what we would love to incorporate into Snapshot down the track. It's a matter of what the priorities are, the resourcing and the funding. Eddie, if you're still there, Sonia's got a question. If Snapshot's not suitable for monitoring and determining if targets have been achieved, how is Noosa Council planning to monitor emissions against targets? Wait for more complete and accurate data, or some other interim method in mind? And Sonia, I highly recommend come to the webinar next Tuesday, because we're going to talk about this. How are you doing it, Annie? Or are you doing it at all yet?
Not as yet, and that's sort of part of the work that we're doing as part of our climate change response plan. We know, well, we're using, as I said, we're using the 500,000 tonnes for the community, but what we will then be doing is looking at each of these various interventions, and like what Lex showed is right at the, as part of his presentation, is to work out what the likely impact of council doing that intervention will be, what will the dollar cost be, and what will be the estimated emissions. So it will be more on a program based as opposed to the total doing a profile every couple of years or whatever, is what I'm imagining it will be. But we're yet to determine that. And so we're looking at, the ways that others have done that also. I know Bass Council in their plan, they have got some really good examples of council's interventions into helping reducing community emissions, and then they also show what the estimated reduction of that program implementation will be.
Is that Bass or Bass Coast?
Bass Coast.
That's the one in Victoria?
Yes, Victoria. Yep.
Cool. Yep, Bass Coast has absolutely got a fantastic plan. And I totally concur with what Emmy just said. And we will get more accurate data and absolutely be able to merge the two together again. But I think the best thing is to make sure that M&E monitoring and evaluation programs are done at that project level. I think it's a thing that we as a sector as a whole have not done well for 15, 20 years, which means that we're not really sure if what we're doing is going above business as usual. So I think that's an awesome question and a pretty important one. And I'd also say that it's not just Snapshot that's not suitable. I just don't think no one can say that they've got an emissions profile that's suitable for this yet. If you have, send it through and let's see and make sure it's compliant. If you've got one, you can put that up on Snapshot instead of ours. We've got no problem at all with that at all. Gail has said, Moreton Bay Regional Council is currently developing an environment and sustainability strategy. How would you use the community snapshot in the development of this strategy? Yeah, good question. I think, Gail, I'd start by, I can send you some resources after this, but look at what Bayside have done. I think possibly Mornington Peninsula Shire, and the Newcastle example before. And I think, look, there's community groups as well that the BZE crew could pass on. I'll make a note of it. But essentially, any program, if you're looking at your environmental sustainability strategy from a climate point of view anyway, you're looking at insight. We might not use the term baseline just yet. If they're used interchangeably, so be it, but you don't want to necessarily get people's expectations up that this is a baseline that we can measure, and insight into the community. So the way I'd suggest it is that's your starting point. And then you use that information to try and look further into, what it means, then developing targets and looking at actions that are actually based on evidence. So things that are going to go above and beyond business as usual, not just sort of things maybe that other councils are doing, or, something that is might sound great, but might not be actually pushing things above. And I use the example of the EV charging. If you ever hear a council saying they've got a target at 50% new vehicles to be electric by 2030, that means they've done nothing, because that's what we're going to see with business as usual, even regardless of what the feds do. So what we need to do as a sector is make sure that 2030 comes closer, or that 50% by 2030 is 70 or 80%. That's when you know that you're doing more. All right, we are right on the end of this presentation, but before you go, we are, I mentioned, having a couple more coming up. So what I'm going to do is just jump into this GoToWebinar question box myself and send everybody a link that, of course, now not going to show. There's a link there, though, that you can see on your screen. Click on that and take through this way. Chat. There we go. That's come after. Okay, I've just put the link into the chat box as well. You probably get an email straight away from this, from the GoToWebinar people automatically, or you click on that there. It's not just feedback. We love feedback, and so we don't mind at all if you say this was good, this was crap, fix it here, do a bit better there, whatever it might be. But we're also with DES looking at what we do for the next couple of webinars. Do we want to focus on data? Do you want more information on hearing from the likes of any or other community groups? Do we want to look at specific areas, whatever it might be? Please jump on there and type it through a million times, because it would honestly take you 1 minute. If you can jump on there and do it now, that'd be great. You'll get the form, you'll get the slide deck and everything that we had here today with all of the comments and the charts and the information. Let us know what we want to see in the next webinar. All right, thank you to everybody who was here today. We really appreciate it. Thank you as well to Annie, our guest, to Beck for the introduction, and we've also had Heidi and Imogen from BZE and Patricia in the background ready for questions. I think you guys will probably be asked a lot more questions at the next one, especially especially if we start talking about community and councils working together. Otherwise, we will catch you next time. When is the webinar about targets? Says Philip, one quick one. It is next Tuesday. I will send the email round, or if you just go to our website, you can find it. Thank you very much. We will chat to you soon.
Thank you, Lex.
Oh, how you going? I'm not sure if we're probably still live, so I'm just going to close this webinar and I'll